We all know the feeling of being totally overwhelmed by a video game. You're playing a match of Overwatch or Marvel Rivals, getting right in the thick of it as a tank, and your screen just turns into a cacophony of colorful flashes as you swing your hammer wildly with no idea what's going on. It's total chaos, and when silence finally falls on the battlefield, you just sit there wondering what the heck just happened. For some players, this is a feature of games like these. They love the chaos and frenzy of it all, and they love the power fantasy of playing as a superhero and spamming a million effects on the screen until everyone winds up dead. You could even argue that it's part of why Marvel Rivals is so popular. However, this style of combat isn't for everybody, and for people like myself and many in my audience, we find these frenetic teamfights to be more akin to overstimulating pixel vomit than real substantive gameplay. Luckily, there's a game out there that solved the problem of visual spam, or at least mitigated how much of an issue it is in those hectic teamfights. Deadlock is a fresh take on the MOBA and hero shooter genres by Valve, and despite having many abilities that seem like they would cause visual clutter, the game has been cleverly and subtly designed in a way that eases up on the problem of pixel vomit and makes it clear what's happening during a fight. In this video, I want to analyze some of the design decisions that lead to Deadlock standing out from other games that serve a delicious color soup on your monitor. There are a lot of subtle choices that might not seem significant at face value, but they add up to create a starkly different experience from other hero shooters when it's time for a big team fight. Before we dive in though, let's get a few obvious points out of the way that you're probably already typing up in the comments. First of all, Deadlock's gameplay loop is drastically different from the many fast-paced game modes in other hero shooters, and many battles are small skirmishes or 1v1s rather than huge teamfights. When there are fewer heroes active on the battlefield, there will naturally be way less visual spam, and that leads to the game being much easier to track than Marvel Rivals or Overwatch. This is a blatantly obvious point, and while there's certainly nothing untrue being said, it's also something that other hero shooters can't exactly do anything about unless they want to turn themselves into a MOBA. I can certainly appreciate this aspect of Deadlock's gameplay design, and I think it's a great thing, but I don't want to dwell on this point in this video because I want to focus on the visual design choices that other games could actually learn from to ease up on visual spam. I don't want every hero shooter to have the gameplay mechanics of Deadlock, but I do want hero shooters to have less clutter and confusion on the battlefield. The next point, however, is actually a counter-argument against the very premise of this video. Deadlock isn't all just small skirmishes and duels, it also has big teamfights where everyone is spamming abilities. To an outside observer, this looks just like the same chaos that's in Marvel Rivals and Overwatch. And you'd be right, it is chaotic. If there wasn't a sense of frenzy in a 6v6 teamfight, the game just wouldn't be fun. However, remember what I said in the intro. Luckily, there's a game out there that solved the problem of visual spam, or at least mitigated how much of an issue it is in those hectic teamfights. Deadlock has solved the issue of mitigating how much of an issue clutter is in a teamfight. Every game has its learning curve where you won't be able to tell what's going on when you're starting out. However, even to experienced Marvel Rivals veterans, the visual clutter going on in that game is simply too much, whereas the complaints about Deadlock's visual clutter are almost non-existent. Legions of videos have been made about the clutter in those games, and videos about them pop up when you search for complaints about Deadlock's visual clutter because there are so few posts about this being an issue. I will certainly concede that as a new player, Deadlock is an overwhelming game to get into, but so too are Overwatch and Marvel Rivals, especially after Overwatch added perks and Stadium to the game. However, once you get past that learning curve, one of these games is clearly superior when it comes to the problem of visual spam in its teamfights, and that game is Deadlock. So, now that we've got the obvious points out of the way, let's dive into the real meat and potatoes of this video. The first major design choice that makes Deadlock's fights crystal clear compared to the muddy fights in other games is the color design. The artists at Valve have made very deliberate choices that make the gameplay crisp and distinctive without sacrificing the visual flair that makes the game look great. We can all agree that Deadlock's map is visually stunning. Sure, it's not a photorealistic depiction of New York with next-gen graphics that require a 5090 to run, but that's because the game has chosen a unique art style that really benefits the game in multiple ways. First of all, just as an aside, the game is a heck of a lot easier to run than Marvel Rivals. Rivals is a stunning game and I will always praise their artists for making a stylized masterpiece, but my god, the game is a beast to run. The file size is gigantic and I can feel my GPU radiating heat onto my face while I'm playing the game. Deadlock is certainly a lot more accessible if you don't have a beast of a PC. However, the point that's actually relevant to the video is this. Deadlock's art style allows Valve to design graphics in a way that's solely focused on aiding visual clarity and enhancing the gameplay. When you look around at the various textures that make up the map of New York City, you can see that they took a lot of design cues from TF2, which is a game that's been praised for almost 2 decades because of its crisp, stylized visuals that maximize visual clarity during gameplay. Many of the individual textures are actually quite plain upon closer inspection. They're often just a basic, desaturated color with minor details carefully placed across them to illustrate things like bricks and tiles. When multiple of these textures are brought together, they form a building that looks very convincing as a mystical shop that you might see in a spiritual New York City. However, none of the textures clash against each other in a way that grabs your attention from the fight. If anything, it almost looks like the textures are fighting to avoid your attention, as if they're all a bunch of introverts at a college party. That's not to say that the textures are ugly. They're not. In the big picture, these textures all come together to create a cohesive and stunning fantasy version of New York City. On a smaller scale, you can stop and take your time to appreciate many of the details and decorations that they've put into this world. And right in the middle of those two pictures where the gameplay actually takes place, the textures fade into the background as the heroes and abilities take center stage. You see, the textures on the map were designed to be desaturated and innocuous so that the characters could be saturated and robust. The character roster is the most important thing in any MOBA or hero shooter because they're what make players attached to the game and they have the biggest impact on the gameplay. It's important to make your characters shine, and that's precisely what Valve has done with Deadlock. Valve are the masters of creating distinct and memorable characters whose visual designs enhance their gameplay. I don't even think it's possible to argue against this claim. Once again, Valve proved their mastery of this concept when they made TF2. Each of the mercenaries are filled with personality, and they instantly convey what character archetype they are through the use of genius color placement, animations, and shapes. The TF2 mercs are so iconic that Valve made the bold decision to not give them outlines during combat like every other hero shooter does, because they can all be identified just by their silhouette. And of course, Valve used those exact same design principles when creating the heroes in Deadlock. Each character is brimming with personality, intrigue, and charm, and they all look completely distinct from one another. They're much more saturated than the map that they're playing on, and their animations and silhouettes allow them to effortlessly stand out from the background. You'll notice that, once again, Valve has decided not to give the heroes in Deadlock outlines. That's how confident they are in their visual design, and that confidence is totally deserved. Let's contrast this by taking a look at Marvel Rivals' color design. Like I said earlier, this game is gorgeous. The artists outdid themselves by making these stunning worlds that are overflowing with beauty and intrigue. If there's one thing I'll glaze Marvel Rivals for endlessly, it's the game's beautiful artwork. However, just because the game has beautiful artwork, that doesn't mean that the art design lends itself to good gameplay. In many ways, Marvel Rivals does the opposite of everything Deadlock does. Its maps are incredibly saturated, and there are many bold landmarks that pull your attention away from the battlefield. If these maps were just meant to be Minecraft builds, then they would actually be perfect, and I'd have no critiques whatsoever. However, because they're meant to be arenas for superheroes to fight in, I must criticize them for their overly busy visual design. Because the maps are so bold, they catalyze the issue of visual clutter before a single ability is even cast. This is because the saturated maps make it harder for the equally saturated heroes to stand out. In some cases, the color palette of a map can even make some heroes blend into the background, which is not great. This is exacerbated further by the heroes' designs. Obviously, Marvel has also mastered making iconic characters like Iron Man, Spider-Man, and Captain America. I wouldn't for a second dare to claim that these are bad hero designs. However, there is definitely some overlap in the poses and animations of some heroes in this game. For example, take a look at the idle poses of Bucky and Star-Lord. Both of them are stanced up holding their guns in front of them at the ready. Their colors are distinct, but their silhouettes are less so. The creators of Marvel Rivals understood this problem would arise eventually due to the sheer volume of heroes they wanted to add, so they decided to give their heroes outlines like so many other games in the genre. However, outlines are not a perfect solution to this problem. By giving every hero a red outline, you actually run the risk of muddying the battlefield even further. The farther away you are, the more some heroes can start to look indistinguishable because they turn into a red blob. They can also blend into the cacophony of abilities littered throughout the battlefield if you also choose to make them red, which is exactly what Marvel Rivals did with their ability designs. You see, while the abilities in Marvel Rivals and Overwatch may look like distinct shades of brilliant white, dazzling yellow, verdant green, or azure blue when you play as the heroes in the game, when you play against them, most of their effects turn some variation of red. This is done to signify that the abilities are coming from the enemies, which is fair enough. However, this leads to the abilities looking quite homogeneous in the heat of an intense battle, and when combined with the red outlines of the enemy heroes and the fact that some maps are also primarily made up of red and orange colors, and you end up with a game that feels like there's a ton of visual clutter. If you're playing as a hero with abilities that are also naturally yellow, orange, or red, then it exacerbates the problem even more because now you're contributing to the issue for yourself. Here's a great example that's still relevant even though it's from a video I made a year ago. Magic is almost completely invisible in this clip because she blends in with the saturated colors of the map, and her red outline blends in with all the red goop that Penny Parker perniciously placed on the point. The one thing that would help with spotting her health bar, is the only thing that isn't there. So she slips right across the room undetected from my vantage point on the high ground. And before you think I'm picking on Marvel Rivals too much, Overwatch does the exact same thing. Their maps also look incredible as standalone pieces of art, but sometimes this map design comes at the detriment of the gameplay experience. Overwatch also redwashes its abilities, which contributes to the problem of visual clutter. In this point fight, for example, the area around the objective is quite red, the character outlines are all red, and the abilities being spammed everywhere are also varying shades of red. It's quite overwhelming, and it even results in me C9ing to avoid D.Va's bomb before saying this. We lost! Dude, what's happening? I am lost! Deadlock solves this problem by making sure that every hero has their own unique ability colors that nobody else in the game uses. Seven's lightning is electric orange, Bebop's laser is a brilliant purple, and his bombs are deep red. Dynamo's abilities are cosmic yellow, Ivy's abilities are the color of Ivy, and Abrams' siphon life is royal blue. You get the idea. Special care has been taken to make sure that every hero's abilities look totally unique and unlike what any other hero has. This is how a Deadlock veteran can easily tell what's going on during a hectic teamfight even though it might look chaotic to an outsider. At all times, you know exactly what ability is being used and by whom because the colors sharply contrast against each other, and even when there is some overlap in the colors being used, the shape and sound design of the abilities easily makes up for it so you can still understand what's going on. Admittedly, part of why Deadlock is able to get away with this is because the game doesn't allow mirror matchups. If there was a Bebop on both teams, one of their lasers would have to be a different color to signify which one you need to avoid. Marvel Rivals and Overwatch both allow for mirror matchups, so they have to change the colors of their abilities. There are also, admittedly, some cases where Deadlock would benefit from changing colors for the enemy team. For example, even if you know McGinnis is on the enemy team, you'd be forgiven for thinking that her Medicinal Spectre can heal you because it looks the same for both teams. Whenever Sinclair steals an ult, it can be difficult to know if it's a friendly or enemy ult if you aren't paying close attention. Of course, you could argue that's intentional, and if so, fair enough. But when Deadlock does change colors for the enemy team, it does so very smartly. Seven's ult is either blue or orange depending on which team he's on, and that's because it's such a big ult that the color change is helpful for visual clarity. When players use the Alchemical Fire item, it will either be purple or white depending on whether it'll hurt you or not. Both of those colors are super distinct not just from each other, but from most other abilities in the game. If you're forced to change the colors of your abilities depending on which team they're on because of mirror matchups, then you should still make an effort to make those colors distinct. Making most abilities the same color of red just hurts visual clarity and muddies the aesthetic of your game. The last way that Deadlock solves visual clutter is by using the less is more strategy for its ability design. What do I mean by this? Well, Deadlock gives you as little information as is necessary for the visual design of its abilities in order to minimize the chaos on screen. Let's go through a few examples. First of all, we have Seven, a hero all about area denial. A less savvy game studio would have easily turned him into a hero that litters the screen with so much spam that you can't see what's happening. But not Valve. His lightning ball is a huge AoE damage ability, but it hardly covers up anything on the screen at all. More than 90% of the ball is actually completely transparent, letting you see all the heroes and other effects behind it. The only visual cues the ball does provide are the much smaller ball in the center signifying where the ball is in space, and the much larger ring on the outside of the ball letting you know how big it is. This visual design is genius. It gives you all the information you need to know where the ball is, where it's heading, and how big it is, but it doesn't take up any additional space on the screen so as not to overstimulate you or obscure what else is happening in the fight. Deadlock did not invent this visual style, but it certainly did master it. Similarly, his ultimate is nothing more than a ring signifying the bounds of the ability and some thin lightning strikes inside the area of effect to make it clear that this is a powerful ultimate ability. Valve made an ability that literally covers the entire battlefield while barely creating any visual clutter. Now, that is downright impressive. Let's take a look at another character, Abrams. Abrams' Siphon Life creates a big area of effect in front of him from which he can lifesteal his enemies. It has a cool looking casting animation, but once that goes away you see that this ability is almost identical to Seven's lightning balls in terms of the information it gives. Most of the area in front of him is transparent, and the main visual component is the blue curved line signifying the bounds of the ability. You don't need any more information to know whether you're in the area of effect or not, so Valve chose to stop there and not overload the screen with extra clutter. You'll notice that the ability's visual isn't super tall either. The most dense portion of the ability is stuck to the ground, and a much more subtle visual extends just a little bit higher into the air. It's just tall enough to let you know that it's there, without obscuring Abrams and the other players. As a matter of fact, many effects don't even reach this high. Lash's Slam and Lady Guy's Spam are both telegraphed attacks, and they're illustrated merely as an outline on the floor, and the visual effects that they do have when they detonate still leave plenty of room to see the enemies within. They don't overstay their welcome either, they disappear almost as soon as they appear. Most hazard zones in the game are the same way. If you drop some fire on the ground as Page or in Furnace, it's flat on the ground. The colors are robust enough to let you know that you shouldn't stand there, but they also don't obscure the enemies any more than they have to. Some visual effects are definitely bolder though. Ivy's kudzu is a thick 3D writhing mass of, well, ivy that takes up a lot of space on the screen. Even this, however, is an acceptable visual effect because it still leaves a lot of space in between the vines to ensure that the heroes are visible. The same can be said for Dynamo's Stomp. It's a thick visual effect, but there's plenty of open space to ensure that you can still see the heroes at all times. His ultimate, however, is one of the only exceptions to this rule. It's big, it's bold, and it covers up a ton of your screen. However, the clutter actually makes sense in this case, because it's one of the most powerful ultimates in the entire game, and it demands that you pay attention to it. It also has the longest cooldown in the game, so it's only ever used once per team fight, and sometimes even less than that. Dynamo's ultimate is the perfect use case for some heavy visual effects that cover the screen, and even then it's actually not so bad that you can't see the heroes within. Valve used many of the ability design principles that we just talked about to make it so that you can actually see what you're shooting at inside of the singularity. Now, let's take a look at how Marvel Rivals differs from Deadlock in this regard. And to be honest, in some ways it actually doesn't. Take Moon Knight, for example. His Onks are quite big abilities in terms of their visual effects, but they use some of the same design principles that we just discussed in Deadlock. They use a single ring to signify the area of effect, and then the Onk itself sticks up in the middle to give you something to shoot at. It's not so tall that you can't see the enemies behind it. This is, by all accounts, a good design. The only thing I'd criticize are the smaller translucent rings on the inside, but they're not too offensive and fit within the style of the game. However, then they have to go and ruin it by adding an extra UI indicator for the Onk above the actual Onk. This absolutely does get in the way of seeing the enemies, and I can't comprehend for the life of me why this is even necessary. Like, the Onk itself is super distinct and clear. I don't know how any Moon Knight player could miss this, especially when you have to deliberately place the ability down in the first place. This extra handholding is not necessary and only adds to the visual clutter of the game. The only reason I can think of for why these ability indicators exist is because the game is so messy that you might lose track of where you placed your abilities amidst the flurry of red flashy effects. That's quite the problem to have, but I don't think the answer to finding your way through visual clutter should be to add more visual clutter. That just doesn't strike me as the right thing to do. Now, that being said, designs like these are rare in Marvel Rivals, and most abilities are much flashier and more opaque than the abilities we see in Deadlock. Let's use Invisible Woman for example. Even though she's supposed to be, well, invisible, she has quite bold effects with multiple abilities that cover the screen in big circles. Instead of leaving plenty of blank space in the middle of the abilities so that you can see through them, her abilities are thick and only semi-transparent all the way through. Similarly, Cloak and Dagger have these moving walls of light and dark that are almost completely opaque and smother a sizable portion of the screen. Cloak's ability is even worse because it actively blinds the enemies, making their screen nothing but purple for a moment and ruining their visual clarity. Even our beloved Jeff the Shark isn't immune from this, with huge opaque effects on just about every part of his kit. And the newest hero is no better, as Deadpool has a horrendously obnoxious ability that covers up your entire UI. It's not bad enough that you can hardly see enemy heroes in this game, now you can't even see your own dang health bar. The creators of Marvel Rivals chose to put blatantly over-the-top effects in their game to fit the superhero theme. It's a design decision that makes sense if you want to create a casual superhero power fantasy game, but it hurts the game for players who want a more refined and competitive experience. Many characters turn into a blur of red flashy effects amidst all the big red bubbles and tracers being thrown throughout the battlefield. Deadlock avoids these extreme effects in favor of more subtle and effective VFX that create a clearer picture of the fight. And in case you forgot that this video was also partially about Overwatch, let's take a look at that game too. Overwatch's ability design is actually quite good in most cases, with a lot of the design principles that I talked about earlier that Deadlock implements. I think the big reason why Overwatch ends up being so overwhelming is the sheer volume of effects being shoved onto the screen at the same time, because the game is much faster paced, as well as the redwashing of effects that I mentioned earlier. However, one more thing that actually works to Overwatch's detriment in regards to visual clutter is that the game is in first person. First-person shooters are immensely popular and I quite enjoy them, but the first-person perspective can also be limiting in a game with as many unique abilities as Overwatch. By placing the camera behind the player, you're able to see more of what's going on around you. Deadlock takes full advantage of this with its third-person perspective, and Marvel Rivals does too. Overwatch, on the other hand, can become overwhelming a bit easier because more of your perspective is filled up with tons of flashy visual effects. Overwatch actually added a third-person camera angle in their new Stadium game mode, and it's quite a nice feature to have for many characters. I quite enjoyed using this camera angle to play a silly Brigitte build because it made it easier to see what was going on around me and intuit the range of my attacks. It shows how the visual clutter of Overwatch can be made a bit easier to manage with a change in perspective. Even though Marvel Rivals is in third person, it suffers more visual clutter than Overwatch because of its VFX design as I discussed earlier. It also goes without saying that the destructible environments, while cool and cinematic, add to the chaos as entire buildings collapse into rubble and create even more mayhem in the already chaotic fights. However, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't admit that sometimes Deadlock does get it wrong. One of the new characters in particular breaks most of the good design rules that we just discussed in favor of more flashy effects, and it shows by just how much more she clutters the screen. Paige is one of the newest heroes added to Deadlock, and her abilities are by far the boldest and most opaque in the game. Her sword is a giant opaque effect that can clearly block the sightlines of other players, her dragon creates a super bright visual that's very distracting, and her ultimate is also a giant visual effect that causes a ton of chaos. All of these effects are beautiful, but they certainly add a lot of visual clutter to the game and make teamfights much more hectic. Deadlock needs to be careful not to add too many more visual effects like what Paige has to the game. Otherwise, it runs the risk of muddying its visual clarity and becoming more like Marvel Rivals. Alright, let's summarize what Deadlock has done to solve visual clutter in clever ways that other games could learn from. Obviously, it isn't all about big team fights, and it has smaller skirmishes where clutter is drastically reduced. However, if we take a look at the game's art direction, we also see some genius design decisions that mitigate how chaotic a teamfight can get once it actually happens. The map is designed with desaturated and innocuous textures that still look great on the macroscopic and microscopic scale, but fade into the background when you're actually focusing on the gameplay. This lets the heroes stand out even more with brighter, more saturated colors. Each hero also also has a unique color palette that makes them distinct from the rest of the cast. The shape, animations, and silhouettes of each hero also play a major role in making them pop out from the background. This character and map design is so effective that Deadlock doesn't need to give its heroes outlines, which actually benefits the visual clarity of the game because red outlines can blend in with the other red visual effects from the enemy's abilities and even the map itself. Furthermore, Deadlock gives its heroes' abilities completely distinct colors, rather than redwashing all the abilities that are on the enemy team. Finally, it uses a less is more strategy when designing an ability's visuals in order to convey all the necessary information about the ability to the player without overloading the screen with too many visual effects. They make effective use of open space and transparency to ensure that the players are visible at all times. Finally, it takes an effective third-person angle that gives the player a greater view of the battlefield than if it was in first person. All of these design principles come together to form a game that has severely reduced visual clutter compared to games like Marvel Rivals and Overwatch. They failed to utilize these design principles to the same degree, and they are significantly messier games as a result. While they can't copy everything that Deadlock does, they can still learn from some of what Valve does to improve their game's visual clarity. Even though Deadlock isn't perfect and it can still get chaotic at times, it's still much more successful at creating a cogent experience for the player than most other hero shooters. But anyways, that's gonna do it for this video. Let me know what you think about my analysis in the comments section down below. Do you agree with what I've said, or is there something that I've missed? While you're down there, make sure to drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos from me. And if you really want to support the channel and keep me making videos like this, then consider joining the memberships program here on YouTube. You get a ton of perks and your support is greatly appreciated. But with all that being said, thank you guys for watching and I will see you all next time. Peace out.